Welcome. This is our third video in our introduction to Judaism. We're going to talk about Abraham in this video. The first two, we talked about the four periods in Judaism, historical periods that are very distinct from each other. The second, we talked about the idea of covenant. Obviously there's two great covenants in the history of Judaism we're going to talk about, the covenant with Abraham and the covenant with Moses. And we mentioned that already. And so we are going to talk about Abraham this time in the Abrahamic Covenant. Once again, beginning, we're in the first major period here in the development of Judaism, the patriarchal period. And we're going to talk about Abraham. And we're dating him somewhere around 2000 BCE. Dating theories range from 2166 to 1812. So you've got a range in there. We don't know exactly when Abraham was born. In fact, you can't prove that Abraham ever existed, I suppose, but the way that the world is represented in Genesis, telling the story of Abraham, there's nothing particularly anachronistic about it. There's nothing that doesn't seem to accurately portray what we know of the way the world was at that time. So anyway, so we're going to talk about Abraham now. And in the first page of your timeline that goes from Abraham to about 600 CE, the first things we're going to talk about is Abraham, God's covenant with Abraham, and his sons Ishmael and Isaac, and his wife Sarah as well. The Abrahamic Covenant begins with Abraham being called by God at 75 years old. And he is called by God to enter into a covenant with him. God promises him that he is going to give him a multitude of descendants. And this is an interesting promise considering that Abraham's 75, his wife Sarah is 65, and she's been infertile her entire life. And I don't know, at 65 maybe she's postmenopausal too, doubly infertile. So this is God, of course, promising a miracle that Sarah would have a son, that he would be the father of a multitude. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this promise in the context of the story here that I'm going to tell you in a minute. But let me just list the first few things in the covenant here. When God tells Abraham that he's going to be the father of a multitude and that he's going to have a son from his wife Sarah, spoiler alert here, it's 25 years before this happens. He's told this at 75. And he has to continue to believe it for 25 years until he's 100 and his wife Sarah is 90. And so, as we talked about in the last video, there's a great deal of faith involved to believe these kind of promises. God also tells Abraham that he is going to give his descendants, this multitude of descendants that don't exist yet, he's going to give them a land that's going to pertain to them forever. And at the time of Abraham, the land is called Canaan or Canaan. And God tells Abraham to leave his homeland and go to this land, not to conquer it or anything. I mean, Abraham's just one family, although he does have lots of flocks and herds and servants and so on. So he's kind of a big group, but still, he's living in the land peaceably. But the promise is that centuries in the future, Abraham's descendants that are going to be a multitude are going to occupy this land, and that God is going to give them this land forever. And finally, his seed will be a blessing to all nations. Now, by the way, these different covenant promises we're getting from a number of different chapters in Genesis. God restates his covenant to Abraham a number of times during this 25-year period. And the last few times it's stated, God gets a lot more specific. So I'm just including everything that we know in terms of all of the revelations from God here, rather than giving you the chronology of when everything became more clear or whatever. It's just easier this way. So when we say his seed, we mean obviously his descendants, or it could be his descendants. What's interesting about this is that when you look at the word here in Hebrew, his seed, it seems to have the same possibilities as we think of, in English. I mean, is he talking about one seed, or is he talking about all of his descendants? Because seed is a collective noun. It's like water. If you go to the store and you're going to buy a bag full of little grass seeds that you're going to put on your lawn, you don't say, give me a bag of grass seeds. You say, give me a bag of grass seed. Seed is the singular and the plural. So obviously there's different interpretations of what's meant by this, especially between Judaism and Christianity, but even within the two religions, there's different interpretations. But among Christians, they believe that this seed that is being talked about is Jesus of Nazareth, who's a descendant of Abraham, and that this seed, this descendant of Abraham, of course, is the blessing to all nations. In Judaism, they're going to have a little bit of a different view on that. In fact, one of the more popular theologies is just that when it talks about seed, it talks about the nation of Israel itself as in many ways having been a blessing to the other nations. And anyway, we can't solve the problem here, but since we're going to be talking about Christianity next, I just want to point out a few things as we're going through the foundational stories of Judaism that are going to be important. Number one, in this Abrahamic covenant, the idea that his seed is going to be a blessing to all nations. This is very clearly affirmed in early Christian theology, that this seed is Jesus. And Paul has a lot to say about that, actually, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul. When a covenant is ratified, now again, this is just Abraham. We mentioned in the last video, it's just Abraham now. And so there's not some huge community of, tens of thousands of people, gathering to enter into some covenant with God. Or this is just Abraham. And there is a point in time when he does do what is generally done when a covenant is ratified. You have some kind of an animal sacrifice, maybe accompanied by a ritual meal, and usually part of the animal sacrificed or part of the meal. There's something ritually important about that. And if you're entering into an eternal covenant, there's a sign of the covenant sometimes, a permanent, what we call an identity marker. And in this case, the identity marker of the Abrahamic covenant, that permanent sign of the covenant, is circumcision. Circum meaning a circle, and cision like incision, cutting. So it is removing the foreskin of the male penis. And I'm sure you know it doesn't grow back. So that's a permanent identity marker. And there are many other kinds of identity markers we see in different histories. Sometimes they might involve tattooing, or they might involve piercing or ritual cutting, but some kind of bodily modification that's permanent. If it's supposed to be an eternal covenant, obviously. So this is where circumcision comes from. Circumcision isn't said to do anything, but it is a sign of the covenant that one has entered into with God. And for the covenant to be honored, you must be fully invested in the covenant. It must be your only hope that you trust in. And this sign of the covenant, this permanent identity marker, says that, yes, I've made my decision that this is the covenant that I trust in for my life. And we're going to come back and talk more about this, what's farther down on this page, but not now, because I have to tell you part of the story first before we can get to a point where the rest of this makes any sense. In fact, I've already given you kind of spoiler alerts, because not everything we've talked about is going to happen right at the beginning here. So let's go on here and talk about the story. First off, let me just give you some of the names that are going to be important here in this week and next week's videos, the foundational stories in Judaism. Okay, and Abraham, his wife Sarah, he has another wife or concubine, not really sure, named Hagar. She is the mother of Ishmael. Sarah is the mother of Isaac. Isaac marries a girl named Rebekah, and they have two sons, Jacob and Esau. Rebekah's brother is Laban, which is where Jacob stays for 20 years, and he marries Laban's daughters Rachel and Leah. God changes Jacob's name to Israel. Israel has 12 sons. Joseph and Benjamin are both the sons of Israel's wife Rachel. Again, Jacob, Israel, the same person. Joseph actually ends up in a high position in the Egyptian government. And we talked about this a little bit when I went through the four periods, 2 videos back very quickly. And we're going to talk about Joseph and Benjamin's brother Judah. There are 12 brothers, but Joseph, Benjamin, and Judah are of particular note in the story here. And this is going to get us all the way through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Jacob's son Joseph, which is one of his 12 sons. So today we're talking about Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, and Isaac. All right, now I also have some maps here just to give you an idea of some things. And This is a map of what the area we're talking about looks like today. And of course, the lines are rough, as you can tell. But this is the way it is today. And you see over here this little tiny area here called Israel. And this is the West Bank area. This is the Gaza Strip area. On the other side of the Jordan River is a nation called Jordan. Directly north here, we've got, well, on the coast, we've got Lebanon, but north of most of the Galilee, we've got Syria here. We've heard a lot about Iraq. We've heard a lot about Iran lately. And if, I don't know how old you are, but there was a point when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and that is when we first started having a conflict with Iraq. Saudi Arabia below here, we'll talk about that a lot when we get to the founding of Islam. And, of course, Egypt over here. So what does this look like back in Abraham's day? Well, here's a map. Now, first of all, where you saw this area here, it says Babylonia. At this point in time, I'm not sure the whole area is called Babylonia, actually. This down here is ancient Sumer. This is what becomes ancient Mesopotamia. This is the Fertile Crescent that you probably learned about when you were in elementary school, assuming they still teach you good things. And but about 1,500 years after Abraham, this area here is going to be a major empire called Babylon. Assyria is going to be the great empire before Babylon. And over in this area is where modern-day Syria is, and it's called Aram. In fact, you see A-R-A-M up here. It's called Aram. So if you're from Syria, you're an Aramean. In this northern area of Syria up here is called Padan Aram. And this will be part of the story here because a major city, Haran, is there. And again, we have below Syria here what is called Canaan or Canaan in this area here. And now there's another map I will show you right here too. Where are we at? Here's another one, different, a little simpler map. And it points out a couple things I like, and that is this southern area here. Babylon is just a very small area. It's going to be over 1,000 years before Babylon starts gaining any strength, to take over the other empires around. But this is ancient Mesopotamia here, the Sumer Valley down here. This area in the Bible is called, going back and forth, this area in the Bible is called Chaldea, because it says that Abraham is from a city called Ur. You see right here, Ur of the Chaldees. And so the people that live in Chaldea are generally either called Chaldees or Chaldeans. You'll see it both ways. This is where Abraham comes from. Migrates north up into this area called Padan Aram to a city called Haran. And this is where Abraham departs from to come down into Canaan here, this land that was promised to him for his descendants by God. So this will give you just a little bit of a visual here of the area that we're talking about here. And not sure which one you'd rather look at. I'm sure you would rather look at anything than my face. So I'm way down in the bottom here. You can ignore me. Again, this is today, and this is back then, and just another version of this. And these are not included in your notes that you downloaded at this point. But I will put another version of the notes on your class website, if you're one of my students, of course. If not, you're welcome to listen to this. But if you're one of my students on the class website, your Judaism notes will have these maps added to it. I'm going to edit it and add the maps later on. But if you have the notes right now at this moment in time, the maps are not included in it. So anyway, Abraham begins in this area here called Ur. And the beginning of the story just talks about a migration. Abraham and his father and his wife, Sarah, and his nephew, Lot. And he moves up from Ur here to Haran. Now, when he leaves with his father, Terah, and he leaves with his wife, Sarah, who is also his half-sister, as we'll see later on in future chapters. Terah is the father of both Abraham and Sarah, but they have different mothers. And by the way, this is very common back in this day and age, so you're going to have to do some bracketing or something. It's a little bit rare to see someone marrying a full sister, but a half-sister happens all the time. And if you're marrying a first cousin or a first cousin once removed, that's actually preferable to marrying someone outside of your family at this point in time. You're trying to keep somehow your family bloodline a little bit more pure. And you'll see later on in the story that when Abraham is looking for a wife for his son Isaac, he makes sure that it's going to be someone from his lineage and not someone from another nation or another tribe. Anyway, so Abraham and his wife, his half-sister, Sarah, and their father, Terah, and Abraham's nephew, Lot. Now, Abraham has two brothers, and they are Nahor and Haran, I believe, the same name as the city up here, strangely enough. But Haran dies, and Lot is his son. So Lot is going with Abraham up north. Now, we're not sure about his brother Nahor. It doesn't say that he's making the trip, but we'll see later on in the stories that Nahor's children live up in this area of Padan Aram. So, Nahor and his family must have migrated up at some point too, though it doesn't say specifically. What happens is Abraham moves up to Haran here, and it says after he's already up there, it tells you the reason why, and that is that God had said to Abraham that he should leave his land and his people, and that he should go to a new land that God is going to show him, that he's going to give to his descendants forever. So Abraham was 75 when he was called by God. Now, he obeys God, and while they're up in Haran, his father Terah dies. Also in Haran, keep bouncing back and forth here. Well, there's Haran. That's okay. Leave this one up. Also in Haran, as I said, his father dies, and he also gains a lot more people in Haran too. He purchases a lot more servants, as we talked about before. The idea of people owning other people is very, very common, and sometimes obviously it will have to do with the conquest and people taken captive, but lots of times it just has to do with financial issues. Someone is sold into slavery because they can't pay their bills. Or they sell children into slavery because they can't pay their bills. And yes, it's a cruel world, but try to bracket, because rich men, they own people. They just do. That's the way it works. The way you would judge someone's ethics would be how they treat their servants or their slaves. Obviously, someone who treats them as somehow being less than human or abuses them or whatever, that would be considered to be unethical. Abraham treats his servants very well. In fact, until his son is finally born at 100, there's a section where it talks about that he's leaving everything he owns to his favorite servant, that's grown up in his house. So Abraham apparently treats his servants quite well. They leave Haran to make their way into Canaan here. Again, Abraham and Sarah and Lot, their father Terah has died in Haran. And there are many flocks and herds. He's a pastoralist. He's very rich. Abraham's a rich man. This is not a poor man. And he becomes so much richer in Haran. And when he gets down into Canaan, he's going to become richer still. God just keeps blessing him. But even leaving Haran, he's a rich man. I mentioned that there's a place where he says that he is leaving everything he owns to his, man that was born in his house, some kind of a slave or something. And so it's interesting that Lot, who is his nephew, is not Abraham's heir, because you would say he is his closest of his kindred. And but Lot doesn't need Abraham's money. You'll find out Lot is very, very rich as well. In fact, when they finally do get down into the area of Canaan here, after a period of time, they've both gained so many flocks and herds that they can't live close to each other. Because what happens is the flocks and the herds get mixed up, and then Abraham's servants end up fighting Lot's servants because they're trying to be faithful and do their job and, keep the cattle. And this is where, I don't know if you've ever read the story, but you'll see the phrase, the land cannot bear us both. And that's generally in a pastoralist sense, where your flocks and herds are taking up so much land that you just can't dwell close to another pastoralist, or your flocks and herds will get mixed up, and that will be a big problem. So they actually have to separate. I just bring that up because it's interesting if you want to think of Abraham as a slaveholder, which of course today we particularly find reprehensible, the fact that he's leaving an inheritance to someone in his household he's not related to, that he loves, rather than to his nephew Lot, which is interesting. And it doesn't really talk about this in the Bible, but I'm going to bring out some things just to think about. Anyway, when they get into Canaan land, Abraham lives there for the most part peacefully. He doesn't go in trying to conquer it or anything. There are a few conflicts here and there. There's only one real major one, though. And that is where there's a battle, and Abraham's not involved in the initial battle, but it's a battle between 5 kings and 4 kings. And after Lot has separated from Abraham, due to the land not being able to bear them both, Lot is living much farther south, towards the area around Sodom, which apparently at the time is a beautiful green valley or whatever. Obviously today, the area in that area is, well, barren, kind of barren desert. But, you know, climate does change over time. But anyway, Lot ends up being abducted, and everything he owns and everybody in his area, it's all taken by the armies that win, and he's taken captive. And so at this point, Abraham, he's got to kick some butt. So he makes an alliance with some other people, and he goes with, well, a few hundred people that he apparently owns. He's gotten very rich now. And he goes and he actually gets back everything that was taken by these other kings. So that is a battle scene. But other than that, for the most part, he's living peacefully with the people there. In fact, sometimes Abraham's, you know, a little bit afraid that maybe someone will take advantage of him. So he's not, you know, he's not some superhero that is always very, very confident. And, you know, he has his misgivings sometimes and his fears sometimes too. He's a man, you know, what can we say? He's not perfect. Now, while they're living in this area here, we go through 25 years, as I said, from the time that Abraham was promised that he would have a son to the time when this son is finally born. That's a long time. And it's very difficult to continue to believe God for that entire time. So a little bit over a decade later, actually it would be about a decade later, because then his first son would be born about 9 months after that. But after a decade or a little after that, of waiting for God to make his infertile wife Sarah pregnant, they have a little bit of a lapse of faith, I guess, and Sarah comes to Abraham and says, "Look, this is my servant girl. Her name is Hagar, and she's going to be my surrogate. She's agreed to be my surrogate, and you know, you can impregnate her, and then you know, she'll raise up children to me." And this is something that can happen, especially if you're rich enough to have servants. You can have a servant that covenants to give you a child if you happen to be a woman that's infertile. And I think I mentioned this before, but in ancient societies, a woman being infertile is really kind of a shameful thing. Many times people would think that you've been cursed by God or by a god for something you did, or maybe something that your father or your grandfather did before you. But that's just kind of like a fate too horrible to bear for a woman of this day, because, you know, a woman's number one goal, number one desire in life is to get married and have children. That's what they want to do. You know, women are not partaking in the same kind of vocations that men are. They're not involved in government. You know, they run households. And so that's a woman's, you know, greatest desire right now. So to not be able to have a child is, you know, hard enough for the woman herself. If she's, you know, in the public eye, you know, people might talk as to, oh, how sad. And so sometimes there will be surrogates, and the surrogate's child will actually be recorded legally as the child of the mistress of the surrogate, if you will. So this is what they have in mind. So Hagar gets pregnant, and Hagar brings forth a son, and his name is Ishmael, or Ishmael, however you would like to pronounce it, is fine with me. And this is, he's born about 11 years after God first appears to Abraham at 75. And God loves Ishmael very much. He's his son. Doesn't say in the Hebrew Bible how he feels about Hagar at all. In fact, it makes it seem like she's just a woman that was the surrogate, and he doesn't have any particularly close relationship with her, is what it seems. after Ishmael is born, what happens is Hagar, the handmaiden of Sarah. By the way, when you hear handmaiden, don't think of a little girl folding handtails. Handmaiden is probably a kind of a privileged a servant or slave that lives in the presence of her mistress, the mistress of the estate, as it were. So Hagar might be a very, very high-ranking, slave / servant at the time. And whether or not Abraham actually marries her, it does not say that he does. It's not uncommon for a man to have a wife or two or three and still have, another woman that he has children by that he's technically not married to. And sometimes they'll call that, ancient stories here, a concubine. And it's not, today we tend to think of it as something disgraceful. It's not really disgraceful at all. Obviously, the concubine isn't going to have as high a status as a wife, but it's not really some shameful thing like he's got his whore on the side. That's not the way it's thought of in this day and age. So again, try to bracket and not be anachronistic in the way that you make your value judgments about this period of time here. Anyway, Hagar starts to feel like, well, she's superior to Sarah. And the problem is Ishmael doesn't really end up being Sarah's son. Why? Because who ends up nursing him? Hagar does. And Hagar, of course, is Sarah's handmaid. So Ishmael grows up knowing who his mother is and bonds with his mother. And so Hagar kind of has a, I don't know, how should we say, a prideful attitude. It's almost like, wow, my son, and again, this is not in the text, but I want you to kind of get the tension here. My son, Ishmael, is going to inherit everything that your husband owns. Now, how do you think Sarah feels about that? Since Ishmael doesn't even like her, Ishmael's bonded to his own mother, it certainly hasn't worked out well for Sarah. Can you imagine the kind of tension that exists here? Because I'm going to leave out a lot of parts of this story. I have to. In all of the stories, I'm going to tell you some main pieces to get the main motifs across, the main themes across, but I can't tell you every story in detail. But tension is developing between the women. And this goes on for some time. I'll skip, some of the details of the stories here. But again, it's because this thing that Sarah does that's supposed to be a blessing to her actually ends up being more of a curse to her. And I guess this is a minor motif here that you'll see sometimes when you have a promise from God and somehow you don't think God's going to be able to pull it off, so you try to help God somehow. It doesn't usually turn out well at all. And in this case, it certainly doesn't. So, in any case, Abraham loves his son Ishmael. Now, time rolls on, and as Abraham is about 99 years old, God visits him again and tells him that Sarah's going to have a son. And in fact, at this point, it actually mentions that Abraham kind of chuckles and goes, how is a man as old as me with a wife as old as Sarah? I mean, how are we possibly going to have a child? And he kind of chuckles about that. And God tells him, oh, you're going to have a child. And when the child is born, you're going to name him Yitzhak, Isaac, which means laughter, or he laughs. So Isaac's name has to do with the fact that not just Abraham, but you'll see Sarah actually ends up laughing too. Shortly after this, very shortly after this, Abraham is camped on the plains of Mamre. You don't need to remember the name necessarily, but remember he's a pastoralist, so they're continually moving around because the flocks and herds need new vegetation to eat after they've stripped one area. So this is where they're camped at the time, and they live in, most people would say tents, but that doesn't put the right idea in your mind. These are very, very heavy-duty temporary dwellings made out of heavy animal skins and stuff, like some of the Bedouins, might live in today. But anyway, this is where they're camped. And Abraham sees three men coming to him in the middle of the day. We're going to find out later on that these are angels. So let me just tell you something before we get started with the story. Okay? We have had a long time to romanticize the idea of angels. And so today, you think of female angels and you think of baby angels, and I don't know, maybe you think that there are doggy angels, but none of this exists in this time. In the biblical period, angels are always adult men, and they always look like humans when you first see them. And furthermore, angels never have wings. Never see it. Again, this is something that's been romanticized. There is a story in Isaiah 6 where Isaiah gets caught up to the throne room of God, and there are some beings called seraphs, or seraphim, that have 6 wings each, but they're in the throne room of God, apparently. Angels on earth, again, always look like adult men, never have wings, and you usually don't know they're angels when you first see them. Now, there are stories where after the angel has delivered his message from God, then he'll do something really interesting, like change into a flame of fire and shoot back up to heaven. And then the people will realize it's an angel and they think they're going to die because there's this idea that you can't see God and live. Fortunately, they do live, and we have the stories. But the point is, angels always seem to appear looking like adult men. The next thing I need to tell you about angels here, and we'll talk about more as we go on, but the next thing I need to tell you about angels is that there is apparently a very special angel called the angel of the Lord. And when you talk about the angel of the Lord, you're talking about an angel that literally is the mouthpiece of God. If you are talking to the angel of the Lord, you might as well be talking to God face to face, which of course is not thought to be possible. But talking to the angel of the Lord is very much seen as the same thing. In fact, there's one story of a judge in the period of the judges named Gideon, and God calls him to lead the armies of Israel. He doesn't want to do it. And he and God are having kind of an argument. And it records some of the argument in the book of the Judges. And there's one place where it says, that Gideon said this, and the angel of the Lord said this, and then Gideon said this, and then the Lord said this. So angel of the Lord and the Lord seem to be exchangeable. They understand the angel of the Lord to be as close as you get to ever having a face-to-face contact with God in any kind of a physical manifestation. So that's the second thing you need to know. What we'll find out later is that of these 3 angels, one of them is the angel of the Lord, and he's the speaking angel. And he comes to Abraham and he says, it's time. About this time next year, I'm going to come back, and Sarah's going to have this child that I promised. So Sarah is doing what any good wife would be doing. If her husband is outside talking to 3 strangers in the middle of the day, of course, she's right inside the tent listening intently. And she hears this angel tell Abraham that about this time next year, when, by the way, Sarah will be 90, that Sarah is going to have a son. And Sarah just ever so quietly just, I guess, chuckles to herself under her breath. And, yeah, right. How shall someone old and fallen apart like me have a baby? And just kind of chuckles to herself. She doesn't think the angel can hear it, but the angel certainly hears it. He goes, why did Sarah laugh? Sarah's like, I didn't laugh. And he goes, you did laugh. So here's the next thing you need to learn about angels. They have really good hearing. Okay? So if you're standing like a football stadium away from an angel and you think you can turn to your friend and say something quietly, don't do it. The angels can hear you from a long distance away, apparently. So anyway, again, Sarah also ends up laughing. And when this baby boy is born about that time next year, they name him Isaac, as they were told to do. Yitzhak, of course, means laughter, because of laughing at God's promise. Isn't that cool? Good thing she didn't fart when she heard God's promise. Maybe they'd have to name him Flatulence or something like that. Anyway, now the tension really gets rough. Ishmael is 14 years older than Isaac, or almost 15, but right in there, so there's no competition. But now the women really, really have a conflict, because it's not just Sarah feeling bad because Abraham's son that doesn't love her is going to inherit everything. Now she has a son too. There's still another issue that causes tension. But besides the attitude of Hagar and Ishmael to Sarah, which of course is manifestly disrespectful, but there's actually a more cultural financial issue as well. And that is in terms of inheritance. Now, all over the world, in most societies, the firstborn son just has a higher ranking and a higher status than any of the other sons. I mean, if the father dies, the firstborn son, he becomes the patriarch of the family. And so also with inheritances, there are different methods here. And at this time, the firstborn son gets what's called a double portion of whatever kind of assets the father has. as well as being the one that is going to inherit any unique privileges, honors, covenants, whatever that the father possessed. If it's supposed to be an ongoing covenant that lasts longer than the father's life, then it passes to his firstborn son. So this covenant that God made with Abraham would pass to his firstborn son, as well as twice as much of what he owes as what would pass to the other son. Now, this is the way it works no matter how many sons you have. If you have 3 sons, then the oldest son's going to get half of the inheritance, and the second and third born sons are going to get 25% of the inheritance, and of course the firstborn son is going to inherit whatever honors or covenants, ongoing privileges that the father had received. So now we have tension, because technically Ishmael's the firstborn son, being 14 years at least older than Isaac, but we have another consideration here, and that is that wives have rankings. So, there's a number 1 wife, a number 2 wife, and whether or not Abraham actually married Hagar and she was his wife, I do not know. But according to any kind of ranking, Sarah's number 1 wife. I mean, he and Sarah have probably been married since they were, teenagers or whatever. I mean, they're brother and sister. They might have grown up in different households, but if so, they were very, very close to each other. And they may have grown up in the same household. So they've been together a long time. And this young woman, Hagar, who served as a surrogate, is not in any way going to be close to the status of Sarah. So according to the status of the wife, sometimes the husband will decide that, well, my firstborn son, or the one that I'm going to attribute that honor to, is going to be the firstborn son of my number 1 wife. Now, when this really gets to be a problem is when either the number 1 wife is not the first wife you marry, or when the number 1 wife is not the first wife to have a child. Then everything is kind of like confused. And so there's a lot of tension between the women, which, if you're looking at this logically, Abraham must not have told them his intentions. Because if they knew for sure who was getting what, and that it had been decided, doesn't seem like they would have as much to argue about. So this is just speculation, but again, if you want to look at these stories and you want to understand why they're meaningful, you have to look at these as real human beings and imagine how they think and why they respond to things the way they do. Things need to make sense. So it's possible that Abraham, trying to just keep the peace or not wanting to address the problem or whatever, has not made it clear what his wishes are. Now, this may not have as much to do with peace between the wives. It might have something to do also with loving both of his sons. And he doesn't want to make any public statements that, gives one son more authority than another now. Who knows? But at any rate, apparently he hasn't specified. And so the tension keeps on building. Now, if he had specified, I think maybe the tension would be less. Who knows? But what happens is, finally, there's so much animosity between Hagar and Sarah, and between Ishmael and Isaac, that Sarah comes to Abraham and says, look, cast out this slave woman and her son. He is not going to be an heir with my son. And Sarah's basically putting her foot down. Abraham may not have said anything, but she knows she's the firstborn. She's been with Abraham probably at least like 80 years, and Hagar's a young woman, may not even be married to him. So, Sarah's basically, she's playing her cards, and she's saying, she's my servant, she serves me, and I don't want her anymore. Kick her out, and her son with her. I no longer require them. And again, I'm adding more to this because I want you to see that if she really is Sarah's servant, Sarah would have the right to do this, to set her free. And in this case, it's not because of good service or anything else. It's because Sarah wants her gone. Now, Abraham hates this. Why? Because he loves Ishmael. Again, there's nothing said about whether he regrets getting rid of Hagar at all, but he loves his son Ishmael. In fact, when God appeared to him the year before Isaac was born to tell him that it's finally getting ready to happen, Abraham has actually asked God, I wish that, Ishmael could live before you, which is a way of saying, enter into a covenant with you. And God actually assures Abraham, yes, he will, he's got a role to play, and he's going to have a multitude of descendants too. Okay. So, Abraham does love Ishmael, but he knows very clearly that, as God said, in Isaac shall your seed be called. This promise that I'm giving to you, Isaac is the one that's inheriting the promise, and he is the one that's going to begin this multitude of descendants, if you will, and Abraham knows this. So he goes to God because he hates this idea of putting out his son Ishmael. And but he prays to God, and God tells him to do exactly what Sarah says, and God once again confirms to him at this time that he's going to take care of Ishmael, that Ishmael's going to have a multitude of descendants, and so I guess Abraham feels better about that. And so he sends away Hagar and Ishmael with some supplies. And in the biblical story, in the Hebrew Bible, this is the last we're really going to see, with a couple of exceptions, of Ishmael. Now, when Abraham finally dies many years later, Ishmael and Isaac will bury him together. But other than that, we don't really hear much about Ishmael at all, except for a little genealogical information about who he marries and who his sons are and all that kind of stuff, which gets included in there here and there. So now it's basically Abraham, and it is Sarah, and it is Isaac. Now, let me mention one other thing here that I should have mentioned earlier, but when God, at one point when God is restating his covenant with Abraham before Isaac's born, he actually changes his name. His name used to be Abram, and God changes it to Abraham. Abram means something like exalted father, but that might be symbolic. I mean, somebody that's very respected in society, you might call him, father, my exalted father. I mean, there are many celibate priests that are not a father of anybody, physically speaking, that are called father by their congregation. So something about that extra syllable changes it to mean something like father of a multitude. But I'm not sure that there's any precedent for Abraham being used as purely a symbolic title. At least I don't know of any. Abraham seems to mean you literally do have a multitude of descendants. You're not just being called Abraham, exalted father, because you're respected in society. And we'll find out later on that name changes are huge when you receive a covenant. When you're receiving a covenant from a greater, sometimes to evidence your new status according to the covenant, the greater will literally change your name. And so Abram's name is changed to Abraham. And Sarah's name has been changed from Sarai to Sarah. And we're going to find out later on, and this is a story I'm going to talk a lot more about name changes, so we can put it on hold for now. But it's when we get to Abraham's grandson Jacob, who, as I mentioned before, is renamed Israel by God. We're going to talk more about this name change and the significance of it then. But suffice to say that in ancient times, names really meant something. And so sometimes coming with a particular honor or covenantal privilege, sometimes a greater, whether it's a greater king or whether it's God himself, is going to confer a name change on the covenant recipient or covenant community or whatever. Anyway, an interesting thing happens next. And this is something that a lot of people don't really understand. And I mentioned this before quickly, but I want to get back to this. Covenants always have some kind of a ratifying sacrifice, it seems, that actually puts the covenant in force. Kind of like we can create legislation in our country today, but it has to be ratified. It has to actually put in force. And so this ratifying act is usually some kind of a sacrifice. Now, way back when, Abraham had a ritual where he sacrificed to God, and kind of miraculously God provides the fire for the sacrifice and burns up the animals. Abraham doesn't even have to set them on fire, so it's an interesting story. But so Abraham probably thinks that's the ratifying sacrifice of the covenant, but apparently not, because now God comes to Abraham and says to him, take your son Isaac, your only son Isaac, and take him to this mount I'm going to show you in the area of Moriah. And the mount ends up being called Mount Moriah. Take him there and offer him as a sacrifice to me there. Now, this is bizarre. And you'll sometimes hear people say, well, I can't believe in a God that would tell someone to sacrifice his own son. Well, you're missing a couple things. First of all, his son wasn't sacrificed, and it was never God's intention for him to be sacrificed. And second, you're a little bit ignorant of this whole idea of the ratifying sacrifice of a covenant, to really put it in force. And that's what makes this really interesting, because Isaac is the promise of a covenant. And it's a great payout. I mean, in this case, it's a miracle, but it's certainly an amazing covenant. And so, you've waited and you've trusted for 25 years for Isaac to be born, the fulfillment of the covenant. And now Isaac's had a few years on him. He's looking good, strapping young man. And God says, I want you to go burn him up on an altar on top of this mount called Moriah. Now, this doesn't make any sense. But if you look at the sacrifice, in a sense, this is the ratifying act of the sacrifice. It wasn't way back when Abraham sacrificed animals to God, when God had first given him his covenant, I mean, long before Isaac was born. This is the ratifying sacrifice. This is the sacrifice that puts everything in force. And this is just like no ratifying sacrifice ever before. You don't wait until you receive all the benefits of the covenant, and then you sacrifice the benefits of the covenant to put the covenant in force. This is ridiculous. My point is, it makes no sense in such a way that it actually makes more sense. Are you with me? So, Abraham, boy, think he went through a struggle when God told him to do that? But whatever it was, he worked it out overnight, because the next morning he saddled up his ass and got his son and headed off to Moriah with the wood to make the fire, and took fire with him, because his Zippo wasn't working, so brought some kind of a torch and kept it burning all the way there. And so Jewish theology and Christian theology completely agree on this particular issue. And that is that Abraham, obviously, what's he trusting in? You should know this by now. He's trusting in God's covenant. What did God promise him? That from Ishmael, or excuse me, not from Ishmael, from Isaac, he is going to have a multitude of descendants. Isaac's not married. Isaac seems to be a virgin. He has no kids. Okay? So if Isaac dies on that altar on Moriah, God makes himself a liar. So Abraham is being challenged, in a sense, to trust God's promise, because God's saying, I told you, Isaac's going to have a multitude. Now he's saying, go put Isaac on this altar and sacrifice him to me there. So if God actually lets Abraham go through with it, he's going to have to raise Isaac from the dead, because Isaac's got to be alive to have descendants. Otherwise, God would make himself a liar. And the other alternative is obviously the more preferable one, and that is that before he actually sacrifices his son, God stops him somehow and reveals that that wasn't really his intent, which is, of course, what happened. The fact of the matter is, this is the final test of Abraham trusting in God's covenant. Sometimes there's a test with a question on it where, one word or a couple words actually changes the meanings of things, and the student doesn't recognize it, and so they put the wrong answer, and then later on they come to me and they go, it's a trick question. And I'll usually respond saying, no, it wasn't. If you actually read every word in the sentence, you would have understood it. You just moved a little bit too fast. You tricked yourself. Well, in this case, this is kind of a trick question, because he's received the covenant promise, and now God is demanding it as a sacrifice before the covenant's been fully fulfilled. So Abraham must realize this is highly peculiar, and I don't understand it. But at this point, I've waited this long for this blessing that was promised to me, and I'm not going to sabotage it by stopping trusting God now. So he goes on the way to Moriah. Now, as they're getting a little bit closer, and Abraham tells the servant that went with him, you stay here, we'll be back in a while. And they head up. Isaac notices, wait a minute, we got the wood, we got the fire, where's the lamb for the offering? I didn't notice, we didn't bring the lamb. And Abraham says, my son, God will provide the lamb for the sacrifice. Now, once again, I mentioned to you, as we go through this story, I'm just going to mention things that later on are very significant in Christian theology, and this is one of them. When Abraham says that God will provide the lamb, Christians believe that lamb is Jesus, and in just a minute you'll see why. So Abraham gets to the top of this mount called Moriah, and puts Isaac on this altar, binds him, but before he can do him any harm, it says the angel of the Lord called to him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham's, I'm here. Don't do any harm to the lad. He goes, now I know that you fear me, and God at that point restates his covenant with Abraham in more certain terms than it's ever been stated before. In fact, some people say, I swear to God. Well, God does the same thing, but there's nobody higher than God, so he swears by himself. Yes, he says, surely multiplying, I will multiply you, and surely blessing, I will bless you. In other words, he's saying, as surely as I multiply people I choose to, as surely as I've ever multiplied anybody, I'm going to multiply you. And as surely as I bless who I choose, and as surely as I have ever blessed anybody, I am going to bless you because you have done this. So this is the ratifying sacrifice Abraham has to trust for decades until he even gets, the promise. And then years after that, he's called to give up the promise. But his willingness to do so kind of fulfills this idea of the ratifying sacrifice that puts the covenant in force. So again, this is, if you understand covenant theology, you understand that this makes no sense, but it makes no sense in a way that it's very, very meaningful, if you get my point. Now, when God stops Abraham from sacrificing Isaac, Abraham looks, and there is a young ram that is caught in some kind of a hedge, a thorn bush or something, presumably by his young rack, maybe. And so they take the ram and they sacrifice him. So in one sense, the prophecy is fulfilled. God's provided the sacrifice, but he didn't say a ram. He said a lamb. And there's no precedent I know of for those words being interchangeable. They just mean different things. Okay? So Christians very much believe that since a lamb was not provided that day on Mount Moriah, but it was a ram that was provided, that therefore the prophecy of Abraham that God would provide the lamb was not fulfilled that day. And they believe that a couple thousand years later, when Jesus is actually crucified, suffering for the sins of the world, as we'll talk about when we get to Christian theology, of course, they believe that this was the fulfillment of the prophecy by Abraham, that God is providing the Lamb. And that's why Jesus is often called the Lamb of God, that takes away the sin of the world. So another interesting thing. Now, last interesting fact about this is that this particular mount here, according to tradition, remained identified as Moriah. It was identified as that all the way through the centuries. Nobody forgot where this was at. And many, many years later, David, the king of the United Kingdom, actually procures this land. It's actually owned by a guy that has a vineyard. But David actually procures this land as the site for the temple he's going to build. And it turns out that God tells him he wants his son Solomon to build the temple. So Solomon does, and it's a glorious temple. But according to the tradition, it is built right on Mount Moriah, on this exact spot where Abraham laid his son to sacrifice him. Interesting, huh? So this is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, this Mount Moriah. Now, you probably know, as we mentioned before, there's no Israelite or Jewish temple on this spot today. There were two of them, as I mentioned in the first video. The first was destroyed by the Babylonians when they took the Judahites captive into Babylon. And then when they come back home under the Persians and rebuild it, centuries later, the Romans destroy it in 70 CE, and this is the second temple that they are destroying. And no temple was ever rebuilt after that because the Jews were evicted from their land, so to speak, exiled from their land. We call this the Great Dispersion, the Great Diaspora. And a few centuries later, there are a couple things that are built on the Temple Mount. One is called the Dome of the Rock, and maybe you've seen it. This big, beautiful, ornate building with this shiny gold dome, shrine in Islam. And this is on the western side of the Temple Mount. On the southern end of the Temple Mount, there is a mosque called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And both of these are still here to this day. And so the Dome of the Rock stands, most experts believe, in the same place where both the first and the second temples stood. Which is interesting because, a lot of people, especially if they happen to be, conservative Jews or Christians or whatever, are hoping for the day the temple is finally going to be rebuilt. And some people talk about it, it'll probably happen any day now. But that's kind of silly. You would have to move the Dome of the Rock. You'd have to take it apart and absolutely remove it before you could build another temple. And you're not going to remove the Dome of the Rock. This is the third holiest site in all of Islam. Nobody's taken down the Dome of the Rock. So if you're going to rebuild the temple, it's going to have to be in another location, which kind of brings up the question if in fact it really would be considered the third temple or just some cheap imitation, since it's not built the same place where God wanted it to be built, the first and second. So anyway, as you know, since 70 CE, that second temple has been gone. So we're kind of to the end of the story of Abraham and Isaac together here. But let's just review a couple things. First of all, we've seen the importance of trusting in the promises in the covenant and keeping the covenant. And this is a little different than our faith today, as I mentioned in the last video, second video on Judaism, because most of us haven't heard a voice from heaven giving us specific covenant promises from God. So a little bit different kind of faith, but nonetheless, I'm not going to say one's better, one's worse. I'm not going to say one's easier, one's more difficult. They're just different ways of believing. In covenant theology, you're trusting God's promises in the covenant. You're trusting them because, one, you trust God. Number two, because you are the covenant recipient. You're part of the covenant community. But three, because the covenant is still in force, because you have done nothing to breach the covenant. You've done nothing to break the covenant, so you can still trust in God's promises in the covenant. And we talked about this the last time. So Abraham had to trust for many decades. And when he makes the decision to take Isaac to Mount Moriah, again, totally agreeing with Jewish and Christian theology here, Abraham he's learned a couple things. Just in these decades of waiting. Perhaps if it happened sooner, he wouldn't have been as sure of the things that he believed. But as long as he's waited, as long as he's trusted, he's learned a couple things. And number one, he's learned that God can do anything God wants to do. If God had given Sarah a son at 65 when Abraham was 75, yeah, that would have been a miracle too, I'm quite sure. But at 90, a woman who is infertile, postmenopausal, and, well past the age of childbearing has a healthy son, that's a miracle. God can do whatever he wants to do. So if God needs to raise Isaac from the dead, God's able to do that. And the second thing that Abraham has learned is that God is faithful. He doesn't break his promises. And so Abraham's learned that, and now that he's learned it and looked back and regretted his doubt and thought, how silly, you should have trusted God all along, God comes along and basically is saying, have you really learned your lesson here? Let's see. Take Isaac to this mountain. I want you to sacrifice him there. And Abraham passes the test. Passes the test. And again, it's not faith versus works, it's faith and works. Faith equals faithfulness. Abraham trusts so much in the promises in the covenant that he does the work he's called to do, and that work evidences his faith in the covenant. There's no dichotomy between the two. Faith, faithfulness, the same thing. Well, we're kind of at the end of the story of Abraham, and we're going to talk about Abraham's son, Isaac, next time. In conclusion, let's just reiterate a couple things. Remember, Abraham had two sons, the oldest one, Ishmael, and this is going to be the son most in focus in Islam today. So when we get to Islam, we'll talk more about Ishmael, because the story about Ishmael is not over yet. It's just over in the Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew story here. We also talked about some major motifs, and we discussed some of them in the context of covenant and trusting God that way. I mentioned a minor motif in that trying to help God be faithful in the covenant didn't work out so well for Sarah. And previously I mentioned a major motif that God often chooses people. When we talk about the mercy of God, he chooses who he wants to enter into covenant with. And he doesn't choose the people you think he'd choose. He chooses people that maybe are not qualified or in the wrong social status or whatever. And people that maybe don't deserve it due to ethical problems. We're going to see when we get to Jacob. He's a real conniver. But God chooses people because he sees what they will be and who they will be when he gets done making them those people. Through whatever they have to go through. As you'll see in Jacob's case, there's some severe discipline he has to learn to become a better man than he is. And so God chooses who he wants by his own mercy. Not always the kind of people that you would think. Sometimes people that aren't qualified and just don't deserve it. Now we're going to have a couple other major motifs coming up, and we'll talk about them then. So until next time, farewell.